Eleanor Ellie Martinez stood in her garden on a crisp autumn morning, admiring the weathered brick exterior of her 1940s craftsman home in Oakridge Gardens. This wasn't just any house. It was the place where she had spent the last 25 years building her life, raising her daughter as a single mother, and establishing her successful home-based photography studio. The vintage character of her home, with its natural aged patina and climbing ivy, had become her signature backdrop for countless wedding and family portraits that had launched her career. Never in her wildest dreams did she imagine that these same cherished imperfections would lead to a nightmare battle that would test everything she believed about property rights and community power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across her front yard as Ellie sipped her morning tea, remembering how she'd purchased this house when it was nothing more than a rundown fixer-upper that nobody else wanted. Through years of careful restoration and countless weekends of hard work, she had transformed it into a beloved neighborhood landmark. Her daughter Maya, now away at college, had learned to ride her bike on the curved pathway that wound through the English cottage-style garden Ellie had painstakingly cultivated. Every crack in the weathered brick, every slightly uneven shingle on the roof, told a story of time, character, and love. Oakridge Gardens had changed dramatically since Ellie first moved in. What was once a diverse neighborhood of unique, historic homes had gradually transformed into a sea of newly constructed beige McMansions with pristine lawns and identical architectural features. The Oakridge Gardens Community Association, formed just 5 years ago, had been aggressively pushing for what they called neighborhood beautification, a euphemism, Ellie would soon discover, for forcing every property to conform to their sterile, cookie-cutter vision of suburban perfection. As Ellie walked down her front path to retrieve the morning paper, she noticed a glossy brochure tucked into her mailbox. Oakridge Gardens, a vision for the future, the cover proclaimed in elegant silver lettering. She almost tossed it aside. These neighborhood newsletters were usually full of pointless regulations about grass height and approved mailbox colors. But something made her pause and flip it open. What she read made her blood run cold. There, in crisp corporate language, was a proposal for Phase 2 of the Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative. Her house was prominently featured in a before and after simulation. The before photo showed her beloved home in all its weathered, characterful glory. The after image displayed a computer-generated rendering of a bland, beige monstrosity that looked identical to every other new construction in the development. But it wasn't just a suggestion. The document outlined the HOA's plan to invoke a newly created aesthetic compliance clause to force the demolition of homes deemed inconsistent with community standards. Ellie's hands began to shake as she read further. According to the brochure, the HOA board had already voted to begin enforcement actions against properties that significantly deviated from approved architectural guidelines. Her house was listed as Priority 1 for aesthetic remediation, a euphemistic way of saying they planned to bulldoze her beloved home and force her to rebuild according to their approved plans. The absurdity of the situation would have made her laugh if it weren't so terrifying. They wanted to destroy her perfectly sound, historical home, not because of any safety issues, not because of any structural problems, but because it didn't match their artificial vision of what a suburban house should look like. The home where she had built her business, raised her daughter, and created countless memories was being labeled an eyesore that needed to be erased. Ellie collapsed into one of her antique garden chairs, her mind racing. She had never joined the HOA. Her house predated its formation by decades. How could they possibly have the authority to force her to demolish her home? But as she read through the dense legal language in the proposal, she realized this fight would be far more complicated than a simple question of HOA jurisdiction. The association had spent years laying the groundwork for this power grab, quietly, passing amendments and building alliances with local officials. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Ellie made a decision. She had poured her heart and soul into this house, transforming it from a neglected shell into a beloved home and thriving business. She wasn't about to let some group of conformity-obsessed bureaucrats destroy everything she had built. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up to the creeping homogenization that threatened to erase every trace of character and history from their community. Setting down her now cold tea, Ellie reached for her phone. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she was going to fight this. Little did she know that her battle against the Oakridge Gardens Community Association was about to become a defining moment, not just for her, but for communities across the country grappling with the growing power of homeowners' associations to dictate and destroy. The late afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass window of Ellie's home studio, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the weathered hardwood floors. She had just finished a family portrait session, capturing 3 generations against the backdrop of her home's original brick fireplace. As her clients gathered their belongings, the grandmother paused to admire the exposed wooden beams overhead. "You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore," the elderly woman remarked, reaching up to touch the rich, dark wood. "My father was a carpenter. He would have loved this house." Ellie smiled, feeling a familiar surge of pride. She had spent months stripping away layers of paint to reveal the original beams, working weekends while Maya did homework at the kitchen table. After showing her clients out, Ellie began her evening routine of backing up photos and tidying her workspace. The late October light was perfect for photography, warm and golden, making even the most camera-shy subjects look naturally radiant. Her booking calendar was full through December. Word of mouth had made her vintage home studio the most sought-after location for family portraits in 3 counties. She was reviewing the day's shots when her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Mom, just got an A on my architecture history midterm. All those summers helping you restore the house finally paid off." Ellie's heart swelled. Her daughter had grown up watching her mother learn to repair crown molding, restore window frames, and match century-old paint colors. Now Maya was studying historical preservation at university, turning their shared passion into a career. The sound of power tools from across the street interrupted her thoughts. The Hendersons' Victorian home, in one of the last original houses besides Ellie's, was undergoing what the HOA called aesthetic updating. The once charming gingerbread trim and wraparound porch were being stripped away, replaced by the same bland stucco and straight lines that characterized every new build in Oakridge Gardens. Ellie walked to her front window, watching as workers carried pieces of hand-carved woodwork to a dumpster. Barbara Henderson had fought the changes at first, but after months of escalating fines and pressure from the HOA, she had finally given in. The renovation was being supervised by Victoria Blackwood, the HOA's newly appointed architectural compliance officer, who stood in the Hendersons' yard with a tablet, checking items off a list. Victoria caught Ellie watching and gave a small, tight smile before making a show of studying Ellie's house, her eyes lingering on the ivy-covered walls and original shutters. The message was clear: "You're next." Ellie let her curtain fall back into place, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. Instead of dwelling on Victoria's implied threat, Ellie immersed herself in her evening ritual. She walked through each room of her house, touching the walls like old friends. In the kitchen, she ran her hand along the restored butcher block counter where she and Maya had rolled out countless Christmas cookies. In the study, she straightened a frame containing Maya's first attempt at architectural drawing, a wobbly but loving sketch of their home's facade. As she climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, Ellie remembered the day she'd discovered the house's hidden treasure. During the initial renovation, she'd removed a damaged section of wainscoting to find a cache of letters dating back to 1943, written by the original owner's son, serving in World War II. She'd tracked down the soldiers' descendants and returned. The letters, but not before learning the story of how the house had sheltered 3 generations of their family through wars, economic downturns, and personal tragedies. Now, watching the sunset paint her bedroom walls in shades of amber and rose, Ellie couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Every inch of this house held memories, not just of her own family's life, but of all the families who had called it home before her. The thought that someone could declare it all worthless, could label nearly a century of history as an aesthetic violation, made her physically ill. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. The sender was Marcus Chen, the realtor who had sold her the house all those years ago. He had become a close friend, often referring clients to her photography business. The subject line read, "Saw the HOA newsletter. We need to talk." Ellie hesitated before opening it, remembering how Marcus had warned her 5 years ago about the formation of the HOA. He had sensed even then that the Voluntary Neighborhood Association would eventually become something more controlling. But even Marcus couldn't have predicted they would go this far. As darkness settled over Oakridge Gardens, Ellie sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the warmth and character of her beloved home. Tomorrow, she would meet with Marcus and start figuring out how to fight back. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply exist in this space she had poured her heart into, wondering how anyone could look at something so full of life and history and see only an aesthetic problem to be solved. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a biting wind that rattled the original leaded glass windows of Ellie's home. She was in her kitchen, preparing for an early client meeting, when the aggressive sound of diesel engines shattered the morning quiet. Rushing to her front door, she froze at the sight before her. 3 massive bulldozers and a fleet of construction. Vehicles lined her street, their yellow paint garish against the autumn landscape. Victoria Blackwood stood in Ellie's front yard, surrounded by a group of men in hard hats and business suits. One of them held blueprints, gesturing at various parts of Ellie's house while Victoria nodded, tapping notes into her ever-present tablet. None of them had bothered to use the front gate. They had simply pushed through her carefully tended cottage garden, crushing decades-old perennials under their boots. "Excuse me?" Ellie called out, her voice steadier than she felt as she stepped onto her porch. "This is private property. You need to leave immediately." The group turned to face her, and Ellie recognized one of the suits, Robert Sterling, the HOA board president, a real estate developer known for building luxury housing developments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mrs. Martinez," Sterling said, his tone condescending, "we're conducting an official architectural assessment. According to our new bylaws, we have every right to be here." He pulled a document from his leather briefcase. "This is an official notice of aesthetic non-compliance. Your property has been designated for immediate remediation under Section 7.3 of the updated Community Guidelines." Ellie descended her porch steps, careful to keep her distance from the group. "I don't recognize your authority here. My house predates your association, and I've never agreed to join. You have no right to assess anything." Victoria stepped forward, her heels sinking into the soft garden soil. "Actually, Mrs. Martinez, the situation has changed. The City Council approved our petition last night. All properties within the Oakridge Gardens historical boundary are now subject to our architectural standards, regardless of membership status." It's for the greater good of the community. The greater good? Ellie's voice rose. You mean for the good of your property values? This house has stood here for 80 years. It's structurally sound and historically significant. Historically significant? Sterling laughed. This neighborhood is evolving, Mrs. Martinez. Your quaint aesthetic is drastically reducing neighboring property values. The council agrees that maintaining consistent architectural standards is crucial for the community's economic health. One of the construction foremen approached with a tablet. We can begin demolition as early as next week. The new construction would take approximately 4 months. Here's the approved design. He turned the screen toward Ellie, showing a rendering of a massive Mediterranean-style mansion that would consume nearly every inch of her lot. You're insane if you think I'm going to let you tear down my home, Ellie said, her hands clenching. Into fists. I have a business here. I have clients scheduled. This house is my livelihood. Your business is another issue we need to discuss, Victoria interjected smoothly. Home-based businesses must conform to strict aesthetic guidelines. Your current operation is in violation of at least 7 different subsections of our commercial activity regulations. Ellie felt her world tilting on its axis. They weren't just threatening her home, they were threatening her entire way of life. Get off my property, she said, pulling out her phone. I'm calling the police. Sterling raised his hands in a placating gesture. That won't be necessary. We've already coordinated with local law enforcement regarding the enforcement of our new mandates, but we'll leave for now. He handed Ellie a thick envelope. This contains all the relevant documentation, including the council's decision and the timeline for compliance. You have 7 days to submit your own architectural plans that meet our standards, or we'll proceed with the approved design. Either way, this eyesore will be gone by spring. As the group filed out of her yard, Victoria lingered behind. You? No, she said, her voice almost gentle. This could be an opportunity. The approved design includes a state-of-the-art home studio, much more professional than, she gestured at Ellie's house, this outdated setup. Ellie stood her ground until the last vehicle pulled away, the envelope clutched in her trembling hands. Only then did she allow herself to sink onto her garden bench, surrounded by the crushed remains of her beloved flowers. The morning's client would arrive in less than an hour, expecting to capture their family's holiday photos in the warm, historic setting they'd booked months ago. She opened the envelope with shaking fingers, pulling out page after page of legal documents, architectural specifications, and compliance notices. The language was dense with legal jargon, but the message was clear. Her home, her business, and her way of life were under immediate threat. The distant sound of construction at the Hendersons' house seemed to mock her. Was this how Barbara had felt, watching her family home being stripped of its character piece by piece? The thought of her own house being reduced to rubble, replaced by some soulless mansion, made Ellie physically ill. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Saw the construction vehicles, don't do anything yet. Meeting this afternoon with someone who can help. Hold on. Ellie took a deep breath, trying to center herself. She had a client coming, and she would give them the same warm, professional experience she always did. But as soon as they left, she would begin fighting back with everything she had. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the stained glass of her front door and casting rainbow patterns across the hardwood floors. Her house seemed to be reminding her of its strength, its beauty, and its worth. 7 days, they had said. 7 days to save nearly a century of history from being erased in the name of aesthetic compliance. Ellie managed to get through her morning photo session on autopilot, forcing a smile as she posed the young family in front of her beloved fireplace. Every click of her camera felt like a countdown. Would this be one of the last family portraits taken in this historic space? Her clients, noticing her distraction, asked if she was feeling well. She blamed it on a headache, not wanting to burden them with the crushing weight of what had just transpired. After they left, she found herself wandering from room to room, touching the walls, the door frames, the window sills, all the pieces of history they wanted to destroy. In her daughter's old bedroom, now converted into an editing suite, she discovered herself sobbing as she ran her fingers along the height marks penciled on the doorframe, recording Maya's growth from toddler to teenager. Would they expect her to preserve these precious markings in their sterile, approved design? Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since morning. Texts from Maya, missed calls from Marcus, and even messages from past clients who had somehow heard about the HOA's plans. She ignored them all, needing time to process the reality of her situation. The thick envelope of documents lay unopened on her kitchen table, its official letterhead seeming to mock her with its authority. Finally, she forced herself to sit down and read through every page, making notes with trembling hands. The language was deliberately intimidating, full of phrases like mandatory aesthetic compliance and community standard enforcement. But beneath the bureaucratic jargon, she found something that made her blood boil. They had already filed permits for demolition with the city planning office. They weren't just threatening to tear down her home. They had already set the bureaucratic wheels in motion. A knock at her door startled her from her research. It was Barbara Henderson, her neighbor whose Victorian home was being updated. Barbara looked exhausted, her usually perfectly styled hair disheveled, her eyes red from crying. "I saw them here this morning," Barbara said as Ellie invited her in. "I had to come warn you. Don't make the mistake I did. Don't try to compromise with them." She collapsed into a kitchen chair, accepting the cup of tea Ellie offered with shaking hands. "They told me if I agreed to minor modifications, they would preserve the basic structure of my house. But once I signed their agreement, they kept finding more things that needed to be brought up to standard. Now," her voice broke, "now there's nothing left of my home except the foundation." Ellie sat across from her neighbor, her own hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "How can they have this much power? This isn't just about property values anymore. They're erasing history." Barbara's laugh was bitter. "You want to know the real reason? I overheard Sterling talking to his investors last week. They're not just trying to enforce aesthetic standards. They're trying to drive out small homeowners like us. Once our properties are updated, the taxes and maintenance costs will be so high that most of us won't be able to afford to stay. They're betting we'll have to sell, and guess who's ready to buy?" The realization hit Ellie like a physical blow. This wasn't just about making the neighborhood look uniform. It was a calculated plan to force out long-term residents and replace them with wealthy newcomers who could afford million-dollar showpiece homes. Her modest photography business, which provided a comfortable living, but not extravagant wealth, would never be able to sustain the costs of maintaining their approved design. As if reading her thoughts, Barbara reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Your house is special, Ellie. It's not just a building. It's a piece of our community's soul. The way you've preserved it, the joy you bring to families who come here for photos, that's worth fighting for." Ellie stood and walked to her front window, looking out at the stretch of identical new houses that had replaced the unique homes she once knew. "I won't let them do this," she said, her voice finding its strength. "I won't let them bully me into destroying everything I've built." Barbara joined her at the window. "Then you better be prepared for war. They'll use every trick in the book: fines, liens, permits, pressure from other neighbors. They'll try to wear you down until demolition seems like the easy way out." Ellie's phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus. "Meeting set up. 3 p.m. Bringing someone who fought them before and won. Don't sign anything." looking around her kitchen at the warm wood and welcoming space that had hosted countless family dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet moments. Ellie felt her shock and grief transforming into something else: determination. They weren't just threatening to demolish her house, they were trying to demolish her way of life, her daughter's inheritance, and a piece of the community's history. "Thank you for warning me, Barbara," she said, finally sitting down to respond to Maya's increasingly worried texts. "But I won't end up like your house. They picked the wrong person to bully." As Barbara left, Ellie noticed Victoria Blackwood walking past her house again, tablet in hand, making notes. Their eyes met through the window, and this time Ellie didn't look away. Let them come with their bulldozers and their permits. She would fight them with everything she had, not just for herself, but for every family whose memories were wrapped up in these historic walls. The grandfather clock in her hallway, a restoration project she and Maya had completed together, chimed 2:30. Time to meet Marcus and his mysterious contact. Time to start fighting back. The historic downtown district was a stark contrast to the increasingly homogenized Oakridge Gardens. Here, old buildings still proudly displayed their original architecture, from Art Deco storefronts to Victorian commercial blocks. Ellie found Marcus waiting outside Riverside Law Associates, housed in a beautifully restored 1920s bank building. "You're not going to believe who agreed to meet with us," Marcus said, guiding her through the brass revolving doors. "Remember Diana Rodriguez?" The name hit Ellie like a thunderbolt. 3 years ago, Diana Rodriguez had made headlines for taking on one of the largest homeowners associations in the state. She'd successfully prevented the demolition of an entire historic district that developers had tried to replace with luxury condos. The elevator carried them to the top floor, where they were led into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows. Diana Rodriguez stood to greet them, her presence as commanding as her reputation suggested. She was younger than Ellie had expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Marcus has filled me in on the basics," Diana said, gesturing for them to sit. "But I need to hear everything from you, starting with any documentation you have of your property's historical status." Ellie pulled out the folder she'd hastily assembled: property records, historical society correspondence, and photographs documenting the house's restoration. "I've also got this," she added, producing the envelope of HOA documents from that morning. Diana spent several minutes reviewing the papers, her expression growing darker. "They've gotten bolder," she muttered, making notes. "This aesthetic compliance clause is new. They're testing the limits of their power." She looked up at Ellie. "Tell me about any verbal interactions you've had with the HOA board." As Ellie recounted the morning's confrontation, Diana's assistant entered silently and began typing up her account. When she described Victoria Blackwood's role, Diana held up a hand. "Victoria Blackwood, are you sure that's her name?" Ellie nodded. "She's their new architectural compliance officer. Been with them about 6 months." Diana pulled out her laptop and typed rapidly, because Victoria Blackwood was involved in a similar case in Palmer Heights last year, under a different name. They tried the same thing, forcing demolitions, for aesthetic reasons, but she disappeared when homeowners started fighting back. She turned the screen to show a news article featuring a younger Victoria, then using the name Catherine Wells. "This changes things," Diana said, standing to pace the office. "We're not just dealing with an overzealous HOA. This is a coordinated effort. Developer groups hire people like Victoria to help push through aggressive renovations. They're usually connected to investment firms that swoop in to buy properties once owners can't afford the mandatory upgrades." Ellie felt sick. "So, this really isn't about property values at all?" "Oh, it's about property values, just not in the way they claim. They're manufacturing a crisis to force out established residents. Once they've demolished enough historic homes, the neighborhood loses its protected status, opening the door for massive development projects. Diana returned to her desk, pulling out a legal pad. But here's where they made their first mistake. They didn't do their homework on your property. She pointed to a line in Ellie's documentation. Your house was individually registered with the State Historic Preservation Office during your restoration. That registration comes with certain protections that even a city council can't simply override. They're hoping you don't know this. For the first time since that morning, Ellie felt a glimmer of hope. So they can't legally force me to demolish it? It's not quite that simple, Diana cautioned. They'll argue that the registration is outdated, or that modifications you've made have invalidated it. But it gives us solid legal ground to fight. She began outlining a strategy on her pad. First, we file an immediate injunction against any demolition permits they've submitted. Then we challenge the City Council's decision to expand HOA jurisdiction over non-member properties. That's a clear overreach of municipal authority. Marcus, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. What about her business? They're threatening that too. Diana's eyes narrowed. They're trying to overwhelm you, attack from all sides. But that's another mistake. Your photography business is a registered historic home occupation, operating continuously for over 2 decades. That gives you additional protection under state preservation statutes. She turned to her computer again, fingers flying over the keyboard. I'm going to file for an emergency hearing first thing tomorrow. In the meantime, document everything. If anyone from the HOA comes to your property, record every interaction. Don't sign anything, no matter what they tell you. What about the 7-day deadline they gave me? Ellie asked. Let me worry about that. Their timeline isn't legally binding. Without proper notice and hearing procedures, Diana handed Ellie a card with her personal cell number. Call me immediately if they try anything, especially if construction equipment shows up again. As they prepared to leave, Diana added one more thing. Mrs. Martinez, you should know, cases like this can get ugly. They'll try to pressure you financially, socially, even personally. Are you prepared for that? Ellie thought of her house, of all the memories it held, of Maya's dreams of preserving historical architecture. I have to be. This isn't just about my home anymore. It's about standing up to people who think they can bully their way through our community's history. Diana nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of determination you'll need. Now, let's get to work before they try their next move. As Ellie and Marcus left the office, she felt both exhausted and energized. The weight of the situation hadn't lessened, but at least now she had a fighter in her corner, someone who understood what she was up against and knew how to fight back. Diana's warning about things getting ugly proved prophetic sooner than anyone expected. The next morning, Ellie woke to find her front yard dotted with small orange flags, the kind typically used to mark underground utilities. A notice had been taped to her door stating that preparatory surveying would begin at 9 a.m. But it was the crowd gathering across the street that really caught her attention. At least 20 of her neighbors stood in clusters, speaking in hushed tones and occasionally glancing at her house. Some held coffee cups from the new artisanal cafe that had replaced the old neighborhood diner last spring. Others clutched copies of what appeared to be a newsletter. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. Have you seen their latest propaganda? He asked without preamble. Check your email. Ellie pulled up her inbox to find a forwarded message from the HOA. Urgent community alert health and safety concerns in historic properties. The attached newsletter featured a photo of her house, heavily edited to emphasize every imperfection. The article claimed that older homes like hers posed significant risks to community well-being, and cited questionable studies about property devaluation. "They're trying to turn the neighborhood against you," Marcus said, "but here's the thing, you need to see something. Can you meet me at the county records office in an hour?" At the records office, Marcus led her to a basement room filled with architectural documents and property records. He'd been there since dawn, following a hunch. "Look at this," he said, spreading out a series of maps on a large table. "These are development plans from the last 5 years. See a pattern?" Ellie studied the maps. Each showed a different historic neighborhood in the county, and each followed a similar progression: formation of an HOA, implementation of strict aesthetic guidelines, demolition of historic homes, and finally, construction of luxury developments. "Now, look at who filed these plans." Marcus pointed to the signatures. Different company names appeared on each document, but as Ellie looked closer, she noticed the same few names appearing as board members or legal representatives across all of them. "Sterling Development Group," she read. "Isn't that Robert Sterling's company?" Marcus finished. "He's not just the HOA president, he's part of a bigger network. They've been doing this all over the state. Buy into a historic area, form an HOA, push out long-time residents, then rebuild at 10 times the density. They spent the next 2 hours digging deeper. The pattern became clearer with each file. The same group, operating under different names, had systematically targeted historic neighborhoods. They would start with a few voluntary aesthetic improvements, then escalate to mandatory renovations, and finally force demolitions. "Here's where it gets interesting," Marcus said, pulling out a thick file. "Remember the Henderson house? Before our HOA bought the adjacent lot, it was owned by a preservation trust. The trust mysteriously dissolved after their board members received threatening letters about building code violations." Ellie's phone buzzed. A text from Diana. "Found connection between Victoria Blackwood and 6 other cases. Meeting at my office 2 p.m. Bringing someone you need to meet." The someone turned out to be James Chen, a former city planner who had resigned after refusing to approve demolition permits for another historic district. "They tried to bribe me," he explained, spreading out his own collection of documents across Diana's conference table. "When that didn't work, they threatened to expose supposed irregularities in my work. It's their standard playbook." James had been quietly tracking the group's activities since his resignation. "They're getting more aggressive," he said, pointing to recent cases. "Used to be they'd at least wait for homes to be sold. Now they're trying to force out current owners directly. Your case isn't just about one house, it's their most ambitious power grab yet. If they succeed, they'll have a precedent," Diana finished. "The ability to force demolitions purely for aesthetic reasons. Every historic neighborhood in the state would be at risk." Ellie sat back, overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd uncovered. "So what do? We gather evidence," Diana said firmly. "James has contacts in other affected communities. Marcus has the paper trail. And you," she smiled grimly, "you have something they don't expect." "What's that?" "A way to make people care. You're not just a homeowner, you're a photographer. You've documented hundreds of families in that historic setting. Each of those families has a connection to your house, to what it represents. We need to show people what's really at stake." As if on cue, Ellie's phone lit up with a message from Maya. "Mom, my preservation professor just showed us something crazy. Remember that article you sent about Victoria Blackwood? She was involved in destroying a historic district near campus last year. Half my class lost their apartments when the buildings were condemned for aesthetic violations. We're all behind you." The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just about saving one house. It was about exposing a systematic attack on historic preservation itself. Ellie thought about all the families who had shared their special moments in her home, all the history those walls had witnessed. She couldn't let it be erased by developers masquerading as community protectors. "Okay," she said, pulling out her camera. "Let's show them what they're really trying to destroy." Back in Diana's office, the team gathered around a large whiteboard, mapping out their battle plan. Diana had cleared her afternoon schedule, recognizing that this case had implications far beyond one historic home. James Chen had brought detailed files on similar cases, while Marcus contributed his real estate expertise. Maya joined via video call from her university, armed with research from her preservation studies. "We need to fight this on multiple fronts," Diana said, uncapping a marker. "Legal, public opinion, and regulatory." She divided the whiteboard into 3 sections. "They're counting on overwhelming you with simultaneous attacks, so we'll do the same to them." Ellie pulled out her laptop, opening a folder of photographs. "I've been documenting every restoration project on my house for the past 25 years. Before and after shots, historical details, everything." She projected a series of images showing the careful preservation work she'd done. Each change was approved by the State Historic Preservation Office. James nodded appreciatively. "This is gold. See these original fixtures you restored? The HOA's demolition plan would violate at least 6 different preservation guidelines." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "I still know people at the state office. They need to see this immediately." Diana was already writing furiously. "First priority, emergency injunction against any demolition or construction work. We file that tonight." She turned to Marcus. "What did you find about property values?" Marcus spread out a stack of market analysis reports. "Their claims about property devaluation are completely fabricated. I've tracked sales data for the past decade. Houses near Ellie's actually sell for 15% more than comparable properties in the upgraded sections. Buyers specifically seek out the historic character. That contradicts their entire aesthetic argument," Diana said, adding another note to the board. "We can use that in the injunction request." Maya's voice came through the laptop speakers. "Mum, remember all those family photos you've taken? Each one is evidence of your house's cultural value to the community. My professor says that's crucial for preservation cases, demonstrating ongoing cultural significance." Ellie's mind raced. "I have releases from every client. We could show how many families have connections to this house." She paused, an idea forming. What if we did more than that? What if we showed the human cost of what they're doing? Diana looked up, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "A documentation project. Not just about my house, but about all the historic homes they've targeted. Before and after photos, interviews with displaced residents, timeline of their tactics, show people what's really happening to our community." James leaned forward eagerly. "I can connect you with homeowners from other neighborhoods they've destroyed. People have been wanting to tell their stories, but nobody's been listening." Diana was nodding. "Perfect. While we fight them in court, we fight them in the court of public opinion. Make it harder for them to operate in the shadows." She added, "Another section to the whiteboard, documentation project." Maya chimed in again. "My whole class wants to help. We can research similar cases nationwide, show that this is a systematic problem. Professor Williams says he can connect us with preservation societies in other states." Marcus, who had been studying property records on his tablet, looked up suddenly. "Found something interesting. Sterling Development Group just registered 6 new shell companies, all with variations of historic preservation in their names. They're positioning themselves to look like preservation advocates while doing the opposite." "Classic misdirection," Diana muttered. "They're preparing for publicity. We need to move fast." She turned to Ellie. "How quickly can you start the documentation project? I have a client cancel this afternoon. Equipment's ready to go. I can start with Barbara Henderson's house, show what they've already done here." "Perfect. James, Get your contacts at the state office to expedite review of the historical documentation. Marcus, I need detailed analysis of every property transaction connected to Sterling's companies. Maya, keep digging with your preservation group. We need all the academic support we can get. Ellie felt a surge of energy. After days of feeling powerless, they finally had a plan, but Diana wasn't finished. One more thing, she said, drawing a circle around everything on the whiteboard. They'll try to isolate you, make you feel alone in this fight. Don't let them. Every person in this room is committed to stopping them. This isn't just about saving one house anymore. It's about protecting our community's history from corporate raiders. As if to emphasize her point, Ellie's phone buzzed with a text from Barbara Henderson. Neighbors are asking about your documentation project. Many want to help. They're tired of watching our history disappear. The rest of the afternoon was a flurry of activity. Diana began drafting legal documents, while James made calls to his contacts. Marcus disappeared into the county records office again, tracking property transactions. Maya coordinated with her classmates, setting up research teams. Ellie drove home to get her camera equipment, her mind already composing shots that would tell this story. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed Victoria Blackwood watching from across the street, tablet in hand as usual. This time, Ellie smiled and waved. Let them think she was intimidated. Let them think she was alone. The real fight was just beginning, and this time she had an army on her side. 3 days into their battle plan, Ellie sat in the courthouse, barely breathing as Judge Caroline Martinez reviewed their emergency injunction request. Diana had worked through 2 nights preparing their case, compiling a mountain of evidence about the historic significance of Ellie's home and the questionable tactics of the HOA. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Word had spread through the preservation community, and students from Maya's architecture program filled several rows, notebooks open. Barbara Henderson sat directly behind Ellie, while James Chen and Marcus occupied seats near the door, ready to provide any additional documentation needed. On the opposite side, Robert Sterling sat with his legal team, looking less confident than usual. Victoria Blackwood was notably absent, a detail that hadn't escaped Diana's notice. She's probably already moving on to her next target, Diana had whispered earlier. They never stick around once their cover's blown. Judge Martinez looked up from the documents, adjusting her glasses. I've reviewed the materials submitted by both parties, she began, her voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. This is an unusual case. The HOA claims authority to mandate demolition based purely on aesthetic grounds, while the homeowner presents substantial evidence of historical significance and proper preservation. She lifted a large photo album. Ellie's documentation of 25 years of careful restoration work. Mrs. Martinez has maintained detailed records of every modification, all approved by appropriate historical preservation authorities. The HOA's claim that the property violates community standards seems to rest entirely on subjective aesthetic preferences. Sterling's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, the HOA's authority to enforce community standards was recently expanded by City Council vote. The aesthetic compliance requirements are clearly outlined in our updated bylaws. Yes, Judge Martinez replied dryly. I've reviewed those bylaws. I've also reviewed the state's historic preservation statutes, which take precedence over local ordinances. The property in question was individually registered with the State Historic Preservation Office long before the HOA existed. She set down her papers and looked directly at Sterling's team. Furthermore, I'm troubled by the HOA's attempts to bypass normal procedural requirements. Issuing a 7-day demolition notice without proper hearings or appeals process shows a concerning disregard for due process. Ellie felt Diana squeeze her arm. This was going better than they'd hoped. Therefore, Judge Martinez continued, I am granting the emergency injunction. No demolition or construction work may begin on the property while this matter is pending. Additionally, she added as Sterling's lawyers began to protest, I am ordering the HOA to cease all enforcement actions related to aesthetic compliance until the full case can be heard. The judge's gavel cracked through the air, and Ellie felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a crucial first step. They had breathing room to fight the larger battle. Outside the courthouse, Maya's classmates swarmed around them, smartphones recording as Diana gave a brief statement. Today's ruling affirms that homeowners associations cannot arbitrarily destroy historic properties based solely on aesthetic preferences. This is a victory not just for Mrs. Martinez, but for preservation efforts everywhere. As the crowd dispersed, Barbara Henderson approached with news. You won't believe what happened while you were in court, she said, pulling out her phone. Someone leaked Victoria Blackwood's employment history to the neighborhood forum. She's worked for Sterling's development company under 3 different names, always targeting historic districts. Marcus joined them, grinning. That leak might have come from a certain former city planner who keeps very detailed records, he said, nodding toward James Chen, who was speaking with a group of preservation students. Ellie's phone buzzed with a message from one of her regular clients. Just cancelled my session with that new approved photographer the HOA recommended. Booking with you instead. Some things are worth fighting for. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. The HOA had been pressuring her clients to use photographers who worked in more aesthetically appropriate modern studios, but people were starting to push back. Diana was already planning their next moves. The injunction buys us time, but Sterling won't give up easily. He's got too much invested in this development scheme. We need to keep building our case. She wasn't wrong. As they left the courthouse, Ellie spotted Robert Sterling in intense conversation with his lawyers. The look he gave her was pure venom. She had disrupted his carefully laid plans, and powerful people didn't like being challenged. But standing there with her support team, her daughter's professor sending congratulations via video call, preservation, students eager to help document other threatened properties, neighbors finally speaking out against the HOA's overreach. Ellie felt stronger than ever. Back home, she found more orange flags had been placed in her yard, despite the injunction. But now they didn't frighten her. She collected them all, photographed them as evidence, and added them to their growing documentation of the HOA's tactics. The sun was setting as she finished, casting warm light across her home's weathered brick facade. A young couple walked by, pushing a stroller, and stopped to admire the house. "We've been following your case," the woman said. "Thank you for fighting. These old houses, they're not just buildings. They're our community's soul." Ellie watched them continue down the street, past the row of identical new houses that had replaced so many historic homes. Today's victory was just the beginning, but it proved what she had hoped. When people stood together, even the most powerful developers could be forced to play by the rules. Her phone buzzed again. Diana, already planning tomorrow's strategy session. The real battle was still ahead, but now they had momentum, supporters, and most importantly, hope. The morning after their court victory should have been triumphant. Instead, Ellie woke to find her driveway blocked by 3 large construction vehicles, not demolition equipment this time. These were from the city's utility department. A crew in orange vests was setting up barriers around her property, and a man in a hard hat was posting official-looking notices on her front gate. Her phone rang before she could even get dressed. It was Diana. "Don't panic," her lawyer said, without preamble. "This is classic retaliation. They're trying to use city regulations to pressure you since the direct approach failed." Ellie threw on clothes and hurried outside, where the crew foreman intercepted her. Ma'am, we've received reports of potential utility line violations. We'll need to conduct a full inspection of your property's infrastructure. Could take several days, maybe weeks. Let me guess, Ellie said, remembering Diana's advice to record everything. She started her phone's video camera. These reports came from the Oakridge Gardens HOA. The foreman shifted uncomfortably. Can't disclose that information, but we have orders to check every utility connection, water, gas, electric, sewage. Have to shut everything off during inspection. You mean shut down my home-based business during peak holiday photo season? Ellie kept her voice calm, but made sure her camera caught everything. May I see the specific violations you're investigating? He handed her a clipboard thick with forms. Every alleged violation was marked, reported by anonymous concerned citizen, but the language was identical to the HOA's aesthetic compliance documents. They weren't even trying to hide their connection. Diana arrived 20 minutes later, coffee in one hand, legal files in the other. She took one look at the scene and pulled out her phone. "Time to call in a favor," she said, stepping aside for a private conversation. Within an hour, a different city official arrived, Christine Torres, Deputy Director of Public Works. She had worked with James Chen before his resignation and remembered how Sterling's development group had tried to manipulate department procedures. "This is completely irregular," Christine declared after reviewing the paperwork. "Anonymous complaints can't trigger full infrastructure inspections without preliminary cause. These orders weren't properly authorized." She turned to the crew. "Pack up. We'll handle this through proper channels." As the barriers came down and the trucks departed, Ellie thought the crisis was over. She was wrong. By afternoon, social media was buzzing with posts about dangerous infrastructure in historic homes. The HOA had launched a sophisticated disinformation campaign, complete with doctored photos showing supposed decay in Ellie's utility systems. Concerned parents were sharing warnings about unsafe conditions near the elementary school walking route. "They're trying to turn the safety angle since aesthetics didn't work," Diana observed, scrolling through the posts. "But they made another mistake. See who's sharing these posts first? All accounts connected to Sterling Development Properties," Maya called from university with more revelations. "Mum, we found similar social media campaigns in other cities where Victoria Blackwood worked. Same scare tactics, same false safety claims. My professor is writing an analysis comparing the patterns." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. It was Mrs. Liu from 2 streets over, a quiet elderly resident who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. "I had to come," she said, clutching a folder of old photographs. "When I saw what they're saying about your house, it reminded me of what happened in my old neighborhood in San Francisco. Developers used the same tricks to force out Chinese families in the 1960s. We can't let history repeat itself." Her photos showed a vibrant historic district, now replaced by concrete high-rises. But more importantly, she had kept detailed records of the tactics used, including utility inspection demands and safety scare campaigns. Diana's eyes lit up. "Mrs. Liu, would you be willing to make a statement? This could help show the historical pattern of displacement tactics." While they talked, Ellie noticed more neighbors gathering outside. But unlike the previous week's hostile crowd, these people carried signs, "Stop the historic home harassment and preserve our community's character." Barbara Henderson had organized them after seeing the false social media posts. "They tried these tricks with my house," she told the small crowd. "Don't fall for it again." Ellie's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Sterling's in damage control. In mode. Just cancelled 3 planning commission appearances. They weren't expecting organized resistance." As the sun set, Ellie sat in her living room with Diana, updating their strategy. The utility inspection ploy had backfired, bringing more supporters to their cause. But Sterling's team was well-funded and determined. "They'll try something else," Diana warned. "Probably building code violations next. but every failed attempt makes them look worse. People are starting to see the pattern. Looking out at the small group still gathered supportively on her sidewalk, Ellie felt a mix of gratitude and determination. The HOA thought they could isolate and overwhelm her. Instead, they were uniting the community against their tactics. Let them try, she said, adding Mrs. Liu's photos to their evidence file. Every attack just proves what we're fighting for. Diana's prediction about building code violations proved accurate, but not in the way anyone expected. Early the next morning, a sleek black SUV parked across from Ellie's house. A man in an expensive suit emerged, introducing himself as Trevor Matthews, chief building inspector for the county. His arrival seemed suspiciously timed until he started talking. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "I need to tell you something about the inspection report Sterling's team has been preparing. They've been pressuring my office to falsify violations." He pulled out a thumb drive. "I've been documenting everything. They tried to bribe me last week, and when that didn't work, they threatened to expose my daughter's past legal troubles." Ellie immediately called Diana, who arrived within minutes. In her office, they reviewed Matthew's evidence. Emails demanding specific violations be found, doctored photographs of Ellie's house, even recorded conversations where Sterling's associates discussed their strategy for forcing the demolition. "They didn't count on someone with integrity," Matthews explained. "I've been in this job 30 years, never seen anything like their operation. They've got people planted in every department that handles building permits or zoning." Diana was already copying the files. "This is exactly what we needed, proof of systematic corruption. But we need to move carefully. They'll guess you came forward when their inspection plans fall through." Matthews nodded grimly. "Already thought of that. I filed for whistleblower protection this morning. Got a friend at the FBI who's been watching Sterling's development group. They're interested in the pattern of bribes and threats." While Diana worked with Matthews to document his statement, Ellie received an urgent call from Maya. Her preservation class had made another breakthrough. "Mom, we found Victoria Blackwood's real name. It's Elizabeth Kane. She used to work for a company called Heritage Demolition Solutions. They specialized in finding legal loopholes to tear down protected buildings. The company was dissolved after a scandal in Boston, but guess who owned it? Sterling Development Group." Ellie guessed. "Through 3 shell companies. Professor Williams helped us trace the connections. We're putting together a full report showing how they've used the same playbook in different cities." The investigation was spreading beyond anything they'd initially imagined. James Chen arrived with more files from his city planning days, showing how Sterling's group had systematically targeted historic districts across the state. Marcus contributed property records revealing a complex web of shell companies, all leading back to Sterling development. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Barbara Henderson's teenage son, a computer science enthusiast, had been monitoring the HOA's website. He discovered that someone had accidentally uploaded internal documents to a public folder, including emails discussing their real estate acquisition strategy. "Look at this," he said, projecting his laptop screen. "They've got a 5-year plan to demolish every historic home in 3 counties. They call it Operation Clean Slate. There's a whole spreadsheet ranking houses by potential resistance and property value." Diana studied the documents carefully. "This is incredible. They're openly discussing using HOAs as fronts for their development scheme. Have you downloaded everything?" The teenager grinned. "Better. I wrote a program to archive it automatically. Even if they delete it now, we've got copies of everything that was uploaded." The evidence was mounting, but so were the stakes. That afternoon, Ellie received an anonymous email with photos of her leaving Diana's office, entering her house, even picking up coffee. The message was clear. They were watching her every move. "Standard intimidation tactic," Diana assured her. They're getting desperate, but this helps us. We can add stalking and harassment to our case. Mrs. Liu arrived with more historic photos and a surprise. She'd found her old neighborhood association minutes from San Francisco, showing similar patterns of harassment and forced demolitions. Different decade, same methods, she said sadly. But this time we have proof. As they organized the growing mountain of evidence, Maya called again. Her professor had contacted preservation societies across the country, and similar stories were pouring in. Sterling's group had operated under different names, but their tactics were always the same: form or infiltrate HOAs, push through aggressive aesthetic requirements, force demolitions, then build luxury developments. It's not just about houses anymore, Maya said excitedly. This is about exposing a nationwide scheme to erase historic neighborhoods. Trevor Matthews returned late that evening with more files. They're planning something big, he warned. Sterling called an emergency board meeting. My contact inside says they're getting pressure from investors to speed up the development timeline. Diana began preparing for whatever came next. They'll be dangerous now that they're exposed, but every piece of evidence makes our case stronger. Looking at the gathered information, Matthew's thumb drive, Maya's research, Barbara's son's website, archives, Mrs. Liu's historical records, Ellie felt both overwhelmed and empowered. They weren't just fighting for one house anymore. They were unraveling a corrupt system that had threatened historic communities for years. Her phone buzzed with another surveillance photo, but this time she didn't feel afraid. Let them watch. The truth was finally coming to light, and no amount of intimidation could stop it now. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source. Ellie was sorting through her morning mail when she found a letter with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "Meet me at the Riverside Cafe, 3 p.m. I was Sterling's personal assistant for 15 years. I know everything." Diana insisted on vetting the meeting. It could be a trap, she warned, but her investigator confirmed the letter writer's identity. Rachel Winters, who had indeed worked for Sterling Development Group until 6 months ago. The Riverside Cafe was nearly empty. When Ellie and Diana arrived, Rachel sat in a corner booth, nervously shredding a paper napkin. She was in her 50s, elegantly dressed, with the polished appearance of someone used to corporate environments. "I should have come forward sooner," Rachel began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they made me sign so many NDAs, and Robert Sterling knows how to ruin people who cross him." She pulled out a thick manila envelope. "But after seeing what they're trying to do to your house, I can't stay silent anymore." The envelope contained 15 years of private meeting notes, internal memos, and correspondence that revealed the full scope of Sterling's operation. Rachel had methodically documented everything, creating a detailed record of their systematic attack on historic neighborhoods. "It started small," she explained, spreading out papers carefully preserved despite their age. They'd buy 1 or 2 properties in historic areas, establish themselves as concerned residents, then push for forming HOAs. Victoria, Elizabeth, whatever she calls herself now, was their specialist in creating architectural guidelines designed to be impossible for older homes to meet. Diana studied a document showing profit projections. "They planned this years in advance?" Rachel nodded. "Sterling calls it community renewal by attrition. First, they make it expensive to maintain historic homes through HOA fines and mandatory upgrades. Then they pressure owners to sell. But your case was different. They saw your photography business as a threat." "My business?" Ellie was confused. "Why?" The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source. Ellie was sorting through her morning mail when she found a letter with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "Meet me at the Riverside Cafe, 3 p.m. I was Sterling's personal assistant for 15 years. I know everything." Diana insisted on vetting the meeting. It could be a trap, she warned, but her investigator confirmed the letter writer's identity. Rachel Winters, who had indeed worked for Sterling Development Group until 6 months ago. The Riverside Cafe was nearly empty. When Ellie and Diana arrived, Rachel sat in a corner booth, nervously shredding a paper napkin. She was in her 50s, elegantly dressed, with the polished appearance of someone used to corporate environments. "I should have come forward sooner," Rachel began, her voice barely above a whisper, "but they made me sign so many NDAs, and Robert Sterling knows how to ruin people who cross him." She pulled out a thick manila envelope. "But after seeing what they're trying to do to your house, I can't stay silent anymore." The envelope contained 15 years of private meeting notes, internal memos, and correspondence that revealed the full scope of Sterling's operation. Rachel had methodically documented everything, creating a detailed record of their systematic attack on historic neighborhoods. "It started small," she explained, spreading out papers carefully preserved despite their age. "They'd buy 1 or 2 properties in historic areas, establish themselves as concerned residents, then push for forming HOAs. Victoria, Elizabeth, whatever she calls herself now, was their specialist in creating architectural guidelines designed to be impossible for older homes to meet. Diana studied a document showing profit projections. They planned this years in advance. Rachel nodded. Sterling calls it community renewal by attrition. First, they make it expensive to maintain historic homes through HOA fines and mandatory upgrades. Then they pressure owners to sell. But your case was different. They saw your photography business as a threat. My business? Ellie was confused. Why? Another recording captured him discussing Ellie's case specifically. She's becoming a symbol for the preservation crowd. Take her down, and the others will fall in line. Nobody will want to be the next Martinez. Diana was already calling her office. We need to get these recordings authenticated immediately. Rachel, are you willing to testify? Rachel's hands shook as she sipped her coffee. That's why I came forward. I helped them do this to 3 other historic districts. I can't live with it anymore. She pulled out one final document, a map marked with red circles. These are all their targeted neighborhoods. For the next 5 years, they've already started infiltrating the community organizations. Just then, Ellie's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Barbara. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow. They're voting on new demolition powers. They're accelerating my timeline, Rachel said, fear evident in her voice. Sterling always does this when he feels threatened, pushes through major changes before opposition can organize. Diana was already formulating a plan. Rachel, we need to get you to my office. These recordings, combined with Trevor Matthews' evidence and Maya's research, we might have enough to stop not just the demolition, but their entire operation. As they left the cafe, Rachel grabbed Ellie's arm. There's one more thing you should know. Sterling's not just after your house. He's planning to rezone the entire historic district. They've already drafted the proposal. Every house over 50 years old would be classified as structurally presumed deficient. They want to tear down everything and start over. Ellie felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. This wasn't just about aesthetic compliance anymore. It was about erasing an entire community's history, but now they had someone who knew all the details, someone who could expose the whole scheme. Her phone buzzed again. Maya had sent new findings from her preservation class. The pieces were falling into place. But would they have enough time to stop Sterling's accelerated plans? Looking at Rachel's haunted expression, Ellie realized how much courage it had taken to come forward. Thank you, she said simply. You're helping save more than just my house. Rachel managed a small smile. Maybe I can finally sleep at night. I've spent 15 years watching them destroy communities. It's time someone stopped them. As they drove to Diana's office, Ellie could almost feel the weight of Rachel's documents in her bag. 15 years of secrets finally coming to light. The question was, could they use them in time to save not just her home, but an entire historic district from Sterling's bulldozers? The story broke faster than anyone expected. By morning, 3 local news stations had picked up Rachel's revelations about Sterling Development Group's systematic destruction of historic neighborhoods. The Oakridge Gardens community forum exploded with activity as residents shared and discussed the evidence of corruption and manipulation. Ellie woke to find a local news van parked outside her house. The reporter Angela Chen from Channel 7 had done her homework. "Mrs. Martinez," she called out as Ellie retrieved her morning paper. "We've been investigating Sterling Development Group for months. Your case could be the key to exposing their entire operation. Would you be willing to tell your story?" Diana had prepared for this moment. "Remember," she'd advised, "focus on the bigger picture. This isn't just about your house. It's about protecting community heritage everywhere." They had carefully selected which documents to release to the media, ensuring Rachel's identity remained protected while exposing Sterling's tactics. The interview took place in Ellie's photography studio, where decades of family portraits created a powerful backdrop. As she spoke, she showed Angela her documentation of the home's restoration, the threatening notices from the HOA, and the evidence of their systematic targeting of historic properties. "But this is what really tells the story," Ellie said, pulling out a large photo album. Inside were pictures of families who had shared their special moments in her historic home, weddings, graduations, anniversaries. Each of these represents a connection to our community's history. They're trying to erase more than just buildings. The story aired that evening, but it was only the beginning. Maya's preservation class had compiled their research into a comprehensive report titled Erasing History, Corporate Development and the Destruction of American Heritage. The report went viral among preservation groups nationwide. Social media erupted with similar stories from other communities. Save Our History and Stop Sterling started trending as people shared their own experiences with aggressive HOAs and forced demolitions. Barbara Henderson's son created a website where residents could upload evidence of HOA harassment and documentation of historic properties under threat. The pressure began to show on Sterling's organization. Victoria Blackwood disappeared completely. Her office cleared out overnight. Several HOA board members resigned, citing personal reasons. But Robert Sterling himself remained defiant, calling a press conference outside his downtown office. "These allegations are baseless," he declared to assembled reporters. "We are simply trying to maintain community standards and property values. The renovation requirements are reasonable and necessary for neighborhood improvement." But even as he spoke, more evidence emerged. Trevor Matthews, the building inspector, publicly released his documentation of attempted bribes and threats. Rachel's recordings of Sterling's private meetings were authenticated by audio experts and released to the media. The story took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Liu's granddaughter, a popular social media influencer, shared her grandmother's photos and story of previous displacement. Her video comparing Sterling's tactics to historical patterns of community destruction went viral, drawing attention from national news outlets. Preservation societies from across the country began contacting Diana's office, sharing similar cases and offering support. The National Trust for Historic Preservation announced they would be investigating Sterling Development Group's activities in other states. By afternoon, protesters had gathered outside Sterling Development Group's headquarters. Many carried signs with photos of historic homes that had been demolished under suspicious circumstances. Others displayed before and after pictures showing the transformation of unique, historic neighborhoods into cookie-cutter developments. Ellie's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Journalists wanted interviews, preservation groups sought documentation, and homeowners from other communities reached out for advice. But the most significant call came from State Senator Catherine Martinez. "Mrs. Martinez," the senator said, "I've been following your case closely. I'm preparing legislation to strengthen protections for historic properties and limit HOA powers. Would you be willing to testify at our upcoming committee hearing?" The publicity was having real effects. The City Council announced an emergency meeting to review the HOA's expanded powers. The State Attorney General's office launched an investigation into Sterling Development Group's business practices. Even the FBI showed renewed interest in the pattern of bribes and threats. Late that evening, as Ellie reviewed the day's developments with Diana, Maya called with more news. "Mom, you won't believe this. Developers in 3 other states are abandoning similar demolition plans. They're afraid of becoming the next Sterling Group." Looking out at the news vans still parked along her street, Ellie felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The truth was finally coming out, but Sterling wasn't defeated yet. His resources were vast, and cornered predators were the most dangerous. "They'll try to discredit you," Diana warned. "Make this personal instead of systemic. We need to stay focused on the bigger picture." As if on cue, Ellie's phone buzzed with an alert. Someone had created a website dedicated to exposing her, filled with distorted facts and personal attacks. But now, she had an army of supporters ready to counter every false narrative with documented truth. The battle was becoming more public, more intense, and more important than ever. It wasn't just about saving one historic home anymore. It had become a fight for the soul of communities everywhere. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the Oakridge Community Center. By 6:30, the parking lot was overflowing. Residents who had never attended a meeting before turned out in force, many carrying copies of the news reports about Sterling's activities. Diana had prepared Ellie for this moment, knowing it would be their first direct confrontation since the evidence went public. Sterling's team had chosen the smallest meeting room available, clearly hoping to limit attendance, but the crowd simply pushed the doors open to the main hall, refusing to be shut out. Robert Sterling stood at the front, his usual polished appearance, slightly frayed around the edges. The remaining board members sat behind him, notably fewer than before the resignations. "This meeting will come to order," Sterling announced, trying to maintain control. "We're here to discuss urgent community safety measures. We're here to discuss your corruption," someone shouted from the back. It was Barbara Henderson's son, laptop open, projecting Rachel's recorded meetings onto the wall behind Sterling. Sterling's own voice filled the room. "These old houses are gold mines waiting to happen. Once we demolish them—" "Turn that off immediately," Sterling demanded. But more projectors appeared in the crowd. Maya's preservation class had created a devastating presentation showing the pattern of destruction in other neighborhoods, and residents had organized their own documentation of homes lost to Sterling's schemes. Ellie stood up, camera in hand. "I move to discuss the evidence of systematic targeting of historic properties by this HOA board," she said clearly. "And I have photographs documenting every step of your campaign against our community's heritage." Diana rose beside her, legal papers ready. "I also move to discuss the multiple violations of state preservation laws and HOA regulatory requirements committed by this board." Sterling tried to declare the meeting unofficial, but Rachel's meticulous records had included the HOA bylaws. Article 8, Section 3, an elderly resident read from his copy. "Emergency meetings called by the board must allow full community participation and open discussion of all raised issues." The meeting quickly spiraled beyond Sterling's control. Residents took turns presenting evidence. Mrs. Liu showed her photos of previous displacement. Trevor Matthews detailed the pressure to falsify inspection reports, and Barbara Henderson described how they had forced her to modify her historic home. "This stops now," declared George Washington, a retired judge who lived in one of the oldest houses in the neighborhood. "I move for an immediate vote to remove the current board and freeze all aesthetic compliance actions pending a full investigation." Sterling's face reddened. "You can't do that. We have contracts, agreements with developers." "Exactly." Maya's voice came through a laptop speaker connected via video call. Her entire preservation class was watching. "You just admitted to having pre-existing agreements to redevelop properties you haven't even acquired yet. That's evidence of conspiracy." Diana smiled slightly. They had hoped Sterling would slip under pressure. The vote was overwhelming. Of the 100-plus residents present, only Sterling and his remaining board members voted against removal. As the residents appointed an interim board, led by Judge Washington, Sterling finally lost his composure. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he shouted. "This neighborhood needs updating, modernizing. You're choosing decay over progress." Ellie stepped forward, her camera recording everything. "No, Mr. Sterling. We're choosing history over greed, community over profit, and we're just getting started." As Sterling stormed out, Diana served him with papers. Their expanded lawsuit now included personal liability for HOA mismanagement and conspiracy to violate preservation laws. But the night wasn't over. Judge Washington called for an immediate review of all pending aesthetic compliance actions. One by one, residents stood to describe the pressure they'd faced. A pattern emerged. Every targeted home was over 50 years old, and every demolition order had coincided with inquiries from Sterling Development Group's shell companies. The interim board voted to suspend all aesthetic compliance requirements pending a complete review. They also voted to provide all documentation to state investigators and to support legal action against Sterling and his associates. As the meeting ended, Ellie felt a profound shift in the community's energy. People who had been afraid to speak out were now sharing their stories openly. Neighbors exchanged phone numbers, promising to support each other against any further intimidation. But Diana remained cautious. "This is a significant victory," she said as they left. "But Sterling won't give up his plans easily. He has too much invested, too many powerful allies. Be prepared for retaliation." Looking back at the community center, where residents were still talking and organizing, Ellie nodded. "Let him try. He wanted to destroy our community's heritage. Instead, he united us to protect it." Her phone buzzed. Maya sending congratulations from her late-night study group. The preservation students had recorded everything, adding it to their growing documentation of corporate tactics against historic neighborhoods. The first major confrontation had ended in victory, but everyone knew this was just the beginning of a longer fight. Sterling's development machine had been built over decades. Dismantling it would require sustained effort and continued unity. But for tonight at least, history had won a round. The morning after Sterling's public downfall, Ellie's phone rang at dawn. It was Karen Mitchell from the neighboring Riverside Heights district. "We saw what happened at your meeting," she said urgently. "Our HOA just announced similar aesthetic compliance rules. We think Sterling's group is behind it." Within hours, Ellie's living room had become an impromptu command center. Diana set up a laptop to document incoming reports, while James Chen mapped out Sterling's known development activities in surrounding communities. Residents from 3 different historic districts arrived seeking advice and sharing their own stories. "Look at this pattern," James said, marking red dots on his map. "Every historic district within 50 miles has either been targeted or is under current threat. They're creating a circle of development, pushing out from the city center. Maya, coordinated remotely from university, connecting affected communities through a newly created preservation network. Her professor had helped develop a rapid response toolkit for neighborhoods facing similar threats. We've identified their playbook, Maya explained via video call. They always start with aesthetic rules, then escalate to safety concerns, and finally push for demolition. But now we can help communities recognize the signs early. Rachel's evidence had sparked a wave of whistleblowers. A former Sterling development employee arrived with internal emails showing how they manipulated property values. A city planning intern brought copies of backdated permits. Each new piece of evidence revealed the scale of Sterling's operation. Barbara, Henderson's son, working with other tech-savvy residents, created an online platform called Heritage Watch. The website allowed communities to report suspicious development activities and cross-reference them with known Sterling tactics. "We've had reports from 12 states already," he announced, showing Ellie the growing database. "Same methods, different company names. Sterling's network is huge." Mrs. Liu organized a group of long-time residents to document their neighborhood's histories. "Every house has a story," she insisted. "Once people know these stories, they're harder to destroy." Her granddaughter's social media campaign, Our Homes, Our History, went national. The movement was growing faster than anyone expected. Preservation. Societies offered support. Architectural historians volunteered expertise, and law students from the state university created a legal aid clinic specifically for historic homeowners. But the most surprising ally emerged from within Sterling's own industry. Marcus arrived with news that several legitimate developers had reached out, disgusted by Sterling's tactics. "They say he's giving all developers a bad name," Marcus explained. "Some are willing to testify about how he undermined their efforts to work with preservation groups." Diana saw an opportunity. If we can show that preservation and development can coexist, it strengthens our case. Sterling's demolish and replace strategy isn't just corrupt, it's unnecessary. The interim HOA board, led by Judge Washington, began reviewing years of decisions. They discovered dozens of cases where historic homeowners had been pressured into unnecessary modifications or forced sales. "We need to make this right," the judge declared. He proposed creating a heritage protection clause in the HOA bylaws, ensuring that historic properties would be preserved for future generations. Trevor Matthews brought more building inspectors forward, each with stories of pressure to condemn historic properties. Sterling's people had a quota, one inspector revealed. They needed a certain number of demolition approvals each quarter to keep their development timeline on track. As the evidence mounted, Ellie realized they needed a way to share this information effectively. She set up her photography equipment in the living room and began documenting everything: the maps, the testimonies, the historical records. Each photo helped tell the story of a community fighting to preserve its soul. But amid the activity, Diana noticed something concerning. Several key witnesses had reported being followed. Rachel's car had been vandalized, and Trevor Matthews found his work files mysteriously corrupted. "Sterling's getting desperate," Diana warned during a strategy session. "He's losing control of the narrative, but he still has powerful friends. We need to protect our witnesses." Judge Washington offered a solution. "My daughter's a digital security expert. She can help secure our communications and documentation." The judge's daughter, Sarah, arrived that afternoon with encrypted drives and secure messaging apps. "They'll try to discredit your evidence," she explained while setting up protected channels. "We need to ensure everything is backed up and verified." As evening approached, Ellie took a moment to look around her historic home. The living room that had hosted countless family portraits was now filled with activists, preservationists, and community members working together to save not just one house, but an entire architectural heritage. Her phone buzzed with another message from a threatened community seeking help. The movement was growing, but so were the stakes. Sterling's empire was vast, and they had only exposed the surface. Maya summed it up during their nightly video call. "Mom, this isn't just about houses anymore. It's about standing up to people who think they can erase history for profit, and we're winning." The challenge now was protecting their growing network of allies, while gathering enough evidence to stop Sterling's operation permanently. The next few days would be crucial. Sterling's carefully constructed facade began crumbling faster than anyone anticipated. The first crack appeared when his chief financial officer, Michael Brooks, walked into Diana's office unannounced, carrying a laptop and several external hard drives. "I can't be part of this anymore," Brooks said, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. "Last night, Sterling called an emergency meeting. He wants to liquidate assets, move everything offshore. He's talking about demolishing targeted properties immediately, regardless of permits or legal status." Diana immediately called Ellie and their core team. Within an hour, they were reviewing Brooks' files, which revealed a shocking web of financial manipulation. Sterling hadn't just been forcing demolitions, he'd been using the properties as collateral for massive loans, then defaulting strategically to acquire more land. "Look at this," Brooks pointed to a spreadsheet. "Every time they'd demolished a historic home, they'd inflate the property value by 300% based on development potential. They've been using these inflated values to secure loans for more acquisitions." Meanwhile, Victoria Blackwood's disappearance had sparked its own crisis. Her replacement, hastily appointed by Sterling, turned out to be even more problematic. The new compliance officer, David Chen, no relation to James, lasted exactly 2 days before having a crisis of conscience. "They gave me a list," Chen told Ellie during a clandestine meeting in her studio. 50 historic homes marked for immediate aesthetic violations. Sterling's exact words were, "Find violations. If you can't find them, create them." He handed over the list, his hands shaking. "My grandparents lost their home to similar tactics in Vancouver. I won't be part of this." The HOA board members who had resigned were now coming forward too. Barbara collected their testimonies. Stories of being pressured to approve demolition orders, threatened when they questioned decisions, and misled about the true purpose of the aesthetic compliance regulations. Sterling's response was swift but clumsy. He called a press conference to announce a historic preservation initiative, a transparent attempt to reframe his activities. But during the questions, he lost his composure when confronted with Brooks's evidence. "These communities need renewal," he shouted at the reporters. "These old houses are holding back progress. Sometimes you have to destroy to create." The outburst went viral. Maya's preservation class created a compilation video contrasting Sterling's progress with before and after shots of demolished historic homes. The hashtag "Last Destroy to Create" became a rallying cry for preservation movements nationwide. Even Sterling's investors were getting nervous. Marcus, using his real estate connections, learned that several major funding partners were quietly distancing themselves from Sterling Development Group. "His financing is drying up," Marcus reported during an emergency strategy meeting. 3. Banks have frozen his credit lines pending investigation. He's running out of options, but a cornered Sterling proved dangerous. That evening, Ellie returned home to find her front door lock damaged and her home office ransacked. Her photography equipment was untouched, but her documentation files had been thoroughly searched. Thankfully, following Sarah's security protocols, all crucial evidence was stored off-site. Diana saw the break-in as a sign of desperation. "They're looking for Rachel's original documents," she explained. "They know her evidence is the linchpin of our case." The incident backfired spectacularly. When news of the break-in spread, Residents organized a neighborhood watch specifically for historic homes. Mrs. Liu's granddaughter live-streamed from Ellie's house, showing the damage while recounting Sterling's pattern of intimidation. More cracks appeared in Sterling's organization. His personal assistant quit publicly, citing ethical concerns. 2 more board members resigned after Brooks's financial revelations. Even Sterling's own son, a junior executive in the company, was seen meeting with federal investigators. The final blow to Sterling's authority came from an unexpected source. The architectural firm that had designed his approved replacement homes released a statement denouncing his methods. They revealed that Sterling had modified their designs without permission, removing safety features to maximize profit potential. The approved designs were never meant for actual construction, the firm's statement read. They were created solely to make demolition orders appear legitimate. We were misled about their intended use. As Sterling's support system crumbled, his behavior became increasingly erratic. Security cameras caught him attempting to enter the county records office after hours. His social media posts, usually carefully crafted by his PR team, became rambling manifestos about progress and necessity. During an emergency call with their expanding team, Diana summarized the situation. Sterling's losing control, but that makes him more dangerous. He still has resources, and he's facing potential criminal charges if everything comes out. Watch your backs. Ellie, reviewing footage from her new security cameras, noticed unfamiliar cars driving past her house repeatedly. The battle wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted. Sterling's carefully constructed empire was showing fatal cracks, and each new defection brought more damaging revelations. Maya called late that night with a question that was on everyone's mind. "Mom, what happens when he finally breaks completely?" Looking at her restored historic home, remembering all the families whose memories were preserved in her photographs, Ellie answered firmly, "Then we make sure no one can ever do this to another community again." The evidence against Sterling Development Group grew exponentially after Brooks' defection, but the most damaging revelation came from an unlikely source. A junior IT technician hired to clean up Sterling's servers instead made copies of everything. The data painted a devastating picture of systematic corruption. "They didn't just target individual houses," Diana explained, spreading printouts across her conference table. "They manipulated entire neighborhoods. Look at this algorithm they developed." The document showed a scoring system rating historic properties based on their vulnerability to pressure tactics. Ellie studied the formula, feeling sick. They assigned points for elderly owners, single parents, people with medical bills. They deliberately targeted the most vulnerable residents first. The IT tech, Alex Torres, had worked through the night organizing the data. "They had different playbooks for different scenarios," he explained, pulling up files. If a house had historical significance, they'd fabricate safety concerns. For properties with strong community support, they'd create false evidence of structural problems. They even had scripts for their HOA representatives to follow. Maya's preservation class worked remotely to analyze the data, cross-referencing it with known cases of historic home demolition across the country. The pattern was undeniable. Sterling's organization had refined their tactics through decades of practice. "Look at this email chain," Maya said during their video call. Sterling actually bragged about how many historic districts they'd modernized. They kept scorecards, competing to see which project manager could clear properties fastest. But the most shocking discovery came from Sterling's private files. The IT breach revealed a detailed map of targeted properties extending far beyond their current operations. Color-coded pins marked hundreds of historic homes, each with a detailed strategy for acquisition and demolition. "This isn't just about our neighborhood," Barbara realized, studying the map. "They're planning to reshape the entire region's architectural Heritage. Trevor Matthews arrived with additional evidence from the building department. "We found irregularities going back 15 years, he reported. "Every demolition permit was approved by one of 3 inspectors. Guess who signed their paychecks through shell companies?" The web of corruption extended into city government. Rachel's meticulous records, combined with the new digital evidence, revealed a network of paid officials who expedited Sterling's permits while delaying preservation efforts. Diana organized the mounting evidence into categories: financial fraud, permit manipulation, harassment of homeowners, falsified safety reports, and environmental violations. Each category could support its own lawsuit, but together they told a story of systematic destruction of historic communities. "We've got them," Diana said, reviewing the strengthened case files. "But we need to move fast. Sterling still has friends in high places." As if to prove her point, Ellie received a call from Judge Washington. The city council was attempting to rush through a neighborhood renewal ordinance that would override historical protections. Sterling's remaining allies were making one last push to legalize their tactics, but this time they faced prepared opposition. Mrs. Liu's granddaughter mobilized her social media followers to flood the council with calls. Maya's preservation. Glass submitted detailed impact studies showing the cultural and economic value of historic districts. Barbara's son used the Heritage Watch platform to alert preservation groups nationwide. The community response was overwhelming. Hundreds of residents showed up at the council meeting, armed with data from the leaked files. When a council member tried to dismiss their concerns, Trevor Matthews projected Sterling's internal emails onto the chamber wall, emails showing how they planned to profit from the ordinance. The ordinance was tabled indefinitely. More importantly, 3 council members recused themselves from future votes involving Sterling Development Group, citing previously undisclosed conflicts of interest. Back at Diana's office, the team worked to organize the mountain of evidence. Alex Torres created a secure database documenting every instance of manipulation and fraud. Rachel's physical records were digitized and cross-referenced with the leaked files. Maya's class developed an interactive timeline showing the progression of Sterling's activities. "We're not just building a legal case anymore," Diana realized. "We're creating a blueprint for other communities to fight back." Ellie spent the evening photographing key documents and evidence, creating a visual record that could be easily shared and understood. Each image told part of the story: maps marked with targeted homes, emails plotting demolitions, financial records showing the flow of money through shell companies. But as their case grew stronger, so did the pressure from Sterling's remaining allies. Anonymous threats increased. Diana's office reported attempted break-ins. Trevor Matthews found his car tires slashed. "They're scared," Diana said during their nightly strategy session. "All this evidence doesn't just threaten Sterling. It exposes everyone who helped him. We're not just fighting one developer anymore. We're challenging an entire system of corruption." Looking at the assembled evidence, physical records, digital files, photographs, testimonies, Ellie understood the true scope of their fight. This wasn't just about saving historic homes. It was about exposing and dismantling a machinery of destruction that had operated unchecked for decades. Her phone buzzed with another message from Maya. "Mom, other cities are finding similar patterns. What we've uncovered, it's just the beginning." The evidence was overwhelming, but now they faced an even bigger challenge, using it to create lasting change before Sterling's allies could regroup and retaliate. The state attorney general's office moved with unexpected speed. At 6 a.m., Ellie watched from her front porch as a convoy of official vehicles descended on Sterling Development Group's headquarters. FBI agents and state investigators carried out boxes of documents while local news teams broadcast live. Diana arrived breathless with news. They're executing search warrants at 17 locations simultaneously. Sterling's home, office, storage facilities, even his vacation properties. They're not taking any chances on evidence disappearing. The scale of the official response was unprecedented. The Attorney General himself, Richard Martinez, held a press conference on the steps of the state capitol. Based on evidence provided by concerned citizens and whistleblowers, he announced, we have uncovered what appears to be one of the largest real estate fraud schemes in state history. This investigation goes beyond simple property disputes. We're looking at systematic corruption, money laundering, and potential racketeering charges. Inside Sterling's offices, investigators found even more than they expected. Hidden cameras captured employees frantically shredding documents when the raid began. But thanks to Alex Torres's IT work, they already had digital copies of everything. Look at this, Trevor Matthews said, showing Ellie and Diana footage from the building department's security cameras. The night before the raid, several city officials had attempted to remove files related to Sterling's projects. They were now being questioned by state investigators. The federal involvement brought new resources and revelations. The FBI's forensic accountants traced Sterling's financial networks, revealing connections to similar schemes in other states. What started as a fight over one historic home had exposed a national network of corruption, Maya called with updates from the academic front. The preservation community is mobilizing nationwide, she reported. Universities are launching studies of historic neighborhood displacement. Professor Williams says our evidence could change how cities approach development versus preservation. But the biggest breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Victoria Blackwood, or Elizabeth Kane, her real name, had been found. After disappearing from Oakridge Gardens, she'd fled to Canada. Now, facing potential charges, she wanted to make a deal. She's willing to testify, Diana announced during an emergency meeting. She has documentation of similar operations in 12 other cities. Sterling's group wasn't just destroying historic homes. They were running a sophisticated operation to manipulate property values and defraud investors. The state's investigation expanded to include the city council. 3 council members resigned abruptly, and the mayor announced an independent review of all development approvals from the past decade. Mrs. Liu organized a community meeting to help residents understand the implications. Her living room was packed as she explained how the investigation could affect their neighborhood. This isn't just about stopping demolitions, she said, pointing to maps showing Sterling's planned developments. It's about protecting our community's future. The authorities are finally seeing what we've been fighting against. Rachel's evidence proved crucial for investigators. Her meticulous records provided a roadmap of Sterling's operations, helping authorities identify key players and pressure points. But the attention made her nervous. Sterling has powerful friends, she warned during a protected witness interview. People who've invested millions in his schemes. They won't go down without a fight. Her concerns proved valid. That afternoon, Judge Washington received an anonymous message suggesting he reconsider his involvement if he cared about his family's safety. Similar threats were delivered to other key witnesses. The FBI responded by assigning protective details to main witnesses and setting up surveillance around threatened properties. Ellie's historic home, now seen as ground zero for the investigation, was under constant watch. Barbara's son expanded the Heritage Watch platform to include a secure reporting system for threats and intimidation attempts. Within days, they had documented dozens of incidents across multiple communities. They're trying to scare people into silence, Diana observed. But it's too late. The evidence is too widespread, too well documented. The Attorney General's office set up a dedicated task force, combining federal and state resources. They established a hotline for reporting historic property fraud, which was immediately flooded with calls from across the state. Maya's preservation class worked with law enforcement to create a database of Sterling's tactics, helping investigators identify similar patterns in other communities. Their academic research was becoming a practical tool for fighting corruption. As evening fell, Ellie sat in her living room with Diana, watching news coverage of the raids. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from other communities, seeking advice and sharing information. "This is bigger than we imagined," Diana said, reviewing the day's developments. Sterling's scheme wasn't just about destroying historic homes. It was about manipulating entire communities for profit. And now everyone's watching. The official involvement had raised the stakes dramatically. What began as one homeowner's stand against demolition had evolved into a statewide investigation of corruption and fraud, but with higher stakes came greater risks. "Be careful," Diana warned as she left. "Sterling's organization is wounded, but that makes them more dangerous. They're not just fighting to save their business anymore, they're fighting to stay out of prison." Looking at her historic home, now at the center of a major investigation, Ellie understood the weight of what they'd started. This wasn't just about preservation anymore. It was about justice, accountability, and the future of communities everywhere. With state and federal investigations in full swing, Diana gathered their core team for critical strategic planning. The Attorney General's office had scheduled emergency hearings for the following week, and they needed to ensure their case was airtight. "Sterling's lawyers are trying to suppress Rachel's evidence," Diana explained, spreading documents across her conference table. "They're claiming she violated confidentiality agreements. We need to prove she was reporting criminal activity, which overrides any NDAs. Alex Torres had discovered something even more damning in Sterling's encrypted files. They didn't just target historic homes," he said, pulling up a complex spreadsheet. "They created artificial property crises. Look at these work orders." The documents showed Sterling's teams deliberately sabotaging historic properties, damaging foundations, creating moisture problems, even introducing hazardous materials. "They damage houses," Alex explained, "then use their planted inspectors to condemn them. Classic manufactured emergency." Maya joined via video call with her own breakthrough. Her preservation class had created a detailed analysis of property values before and after Sterling's interventions. The data shows their entire property value argument was fabricated, she reported. Neighborhoods actually lost value after historic homes were demolished. The only ones profiting were Sterling's shell companies. Mrs. Liu arrived with a stack of photo albums, not just her own documentation, but collections gathered from long-time residents throughout the area. "Every picture tells a story," she said, laying them out carefully. "Every demolished house was someone's home, someone's history." Barbara Henderson had been working with her son to compile digital evidence. Their Heritage Watch platform had collected hundreds of testimonies from affected homeowners across multiple states. "We've identified 47 different shell companies connected to Sterling," she reported, all using the same playbook. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Trevor Matthews had been reviewing building department records when he found a hidden pattern. "Look at the inspection dates," he said, pointing to a series of reports. "Every condemned historic property was inspected on a Friday afternoon. Know why? Because the Preservation Office closes early on Fridays. By Monday, the demolition would already be complete." Diana immediately saw the implications. They deliberately timed their actions to prevent appeals. This shows premeditation and systematic abuse of process. James Chen, working with his contacts in city planning, had tracked down former officials who'd been pressured to approve Sterling's projects. "They're willing to testify," he reported. "Some were threatened, others bribed, but they all have documentation. Ellie spent the day photographing and cataloguing every piece of evidence. Each document, email, and photograph needed to be perfectly preserved and authenticated. The story they told was devastating, a years-long conspiracy to erase historic communities for profit. But as they prepared their case, warning signs appeared. Rachel reported being followed by unmarked cars. Trevor Matthews' office was broken into, though their secured copies of evidence remained safe. Even Maya reported suspicious attempts to access her university research files. "They're getting desperate," Diana warned during a strategy session. "Sterling's investors are jumping ship, his political allies are distancing themselves, and his legal team is running out of options. That makes him dangerous." The team implemented stricter security measures. Sarah, Judge Washington's daughter, set up encrypted communications for all key witnesses. Barbara's son enhanced the Heritage Watch platform's security after detecting multiple hacking attempts. Mrs. Liu's granddaughter used her social media influence to ensure public attention stayed focused on the case. "The more people watching, the harder it is for them to operate in shadows," she explained, as her live streams of evidence compilation gained thousands of viewers. Late that night, as Ellie reviewed case materials in her historic home, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Victoria Blackwood, Elizabeth Kane, escorted by federal agents. "I need to show you something," Elizabeth said, pulling out a worn notebook. "Sterling doesn't just destroy houses, he destroys lives. I kept records of every family displaced, every community broken. Their stories need to be told." Her documentation provided the human element their case needed. Each entry detailed not just the technical aspects of displacement, but the personal cost to families and communities. Diana worked through the night incorporating the new evidence. "We're not just proving criminal activity," she said, surrounded by files and photographs. "We're showing the real impact of their schemes. This isn't about buildings anymore. It's about justice for every family they've hurt." As dawn approached, Ellie stood in her garden, watching security teams patrol the neighborhood. Her historic home had become more than just a symbol of resistance. It was now the gathering point for a movement to protect community heritage everywhere. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maya. "Mom, preservation societies nationwide are standing with us. Whatever happens next, we've already changed how people think about historic communities. The evidence was ready. Their witnesses were prepared. Now they just had to hope it would be enough to not just stop Sterling, but to prevent anyone from repeating his schemes in the future." Looking at her house in the early morning light, Ellie felt the weight of what they'd built. Not just a legal case, but a blueprint for communities to fight back against corporate destruction of their heritage. The final battle was approaching, and this time they were ready. The courthouse steps were crowded with media, preservation activists, and community members as Ellie arrived for the hearing. Sterling Development Group's fate and the future of historic preservation in the state would be decided in courtroom 302. Judge Catherine Martinez, known for her thorough examination of complex cases, presided. The courtroom was packed, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. Maya's entire preservation class had traveled to attend, joining residents from communities affected by Sterling's operations. Sterling arrived with an army of lawyers, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. The strain of recent weeks showed on his face. His remaining allies sat behind him, notably fewer than before, while Victoria Blackwood, now Elizabeth Kane, sat with the prosecution, ready to testify. Diana opened with a devastating presentation. "This case is about more than one historic home, or one developer's greed," she began, projecting images of demolished historic properties. "It's about a systematic conspiracy to destroy our community's heritage for profit." The evidence unfolded, like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Trevor Matthews testified about falsified inspection reports, supported by documented proof of Sterling's interference. Rachel presented her meticulous records, each entry revealing another layer of corruption. They didn't just target buildings, Rachel testified, her voice steady despite Sterling's glare. They targeted vulnerable homeowners, single parents, elderly residents, families facing medical bills, anyone they thought wouldn't have resources. To fight back, Alex Torres's technical evidence proved devastating. His screen captures showed Sterling's algorithms for identifying vulnerable properties, complete with scoring systems for potential resistance. They rated houses based on the likelihood of community opposition, he explained. The more historical significance, the more aggressive their tactics. Sterling's lawyers tried to object, claiming the data was obtained illegally, but Judge Martinez shut them down. The whistleblower protections clearly apply here, she ruled. The evidence stands. Mrs. Liu's testimony brought the human cost into sharp focus. Her photographs and stories of displaced families drew tears from many in the courtroom. When Sterling's lawyer attempted to dismiss her evidence as mere sentiment, she responded with detailed records of property values and community impact. The turning point came during Elizabeth Kane's testimony. She methodically outlined Sterling's operations in multiple cities, supported by documentation from each project. It was never about community improvement, she revealed. The aesthetic violations, the safety concerns, they were all manufactured to justify demolition. Sterling finally cracked during cross-examination. When Diana pressed him about the targeting algorithm, he exploded. "These old houses are obstacles to progress," he shouted. "You're all living in the past. Sometimes you have to destroy things to move forward." The outburst confirmed everything they'd been proving. Judge Martinez called a brief recess, during which Diana received urgent news. Federal prosecutors were filing additional charges based on evidence of interstate fraud. When court resumed, Maya's preservation class presented their academic research, showing how Sterling's actions violated not just local laws, but national preservation standards. Their analysis of property values demolished his claims about community improvement. Barbara Henderson's testimony about her own home's forced modifications resonated deeply. "They didn't just change our houses," she said. "They tried to erase our community's identity." Sterling's defense began to unravel. His experts contradicted each other about safety standards. His financial officers couldn't explain the web of shell companies. When confronted with Rachel's records, his lawyers resorted to technical objections that Judge Martinez quickly overruled. The final blow came from James Chen, who presented city planning documents showing how Sterling's group had manipulated zoning laws. "They didn't just break the rules," he testified. "They rewrote them to legalize their destruction." As the evidence mounted, Sterling's remaining supporters began slipping out of the courtroom. His lead lawyer passed a note, presumably suggesting a plea deal, but Sterling angrily waved it away. Judge Martinez listened intently throughout, taking detailed notes. When the last witness finished, she did something unusual. She asked to see Ellie's photographs of her historic home, both from before Sterling's threats and after their fight began. "These images," the judge observed, "tell us something important about community values. They show us what we stand to lose when we allow profit to override preservation." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Martinez began her ruling. Sterling sat rigid while Diana squeezed Ellie's hand. Everything they'd fought for came down to this moment. Behind them, Maya whispered words of encouragement. Mrs. Liu clutched her photos. Barbara Henderson held her son's hand. Trevor Matthews and Rachel exchanged nervous glances. The entire preservation community seemed to hold its breath. The future of historic preservation hung in the balance, and Judge Martinez was about to decide whether community heritage would triumph over corporate greed. Judge Martinez's ruling was comprehensive and devastating to Sterling's empire. The evidence presented demonstrates not just individual violations, but a systematic conspiracy to destroy historic properties for profit, she began, her voice filling the hushed courtroom. Sterling Development Group and its associates are hereby permanently enjoined from any involvement in historic property development or homeowners associations. All pending demolition permits are revoked. All properties acquired through documented fraudulent means must be returned to their original owners or their heirs with full restitution. The judge turned directly to Sterling, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. Furthermore, this court finds substantial evidence of criminal activity warranting immediate referral to federal prosecutors. Mr. Sterling, you have not merely violated laws, you have betrayed the trust of communities and attempted to erase their heritage for personal gain. The penalties were unprecedented. Sterling Development Group was ordered to establish a $50 million restoration fund for historic properties. All HOA regulations created under Sterling's influence were invalidated. The company's assets were frozen, pending criminal investigation, but the judge wasn't finished. This case has revealed systemic failures in how we protect historic communities, she continued. Therefore, I am recommending the creation of a state-level historic preservation oversight committee with real enforcement powers and community representation. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Maya's preservation class hugged each other while Mrs. Liu wiped tears from her eyes. Barbara Henderson grabbed her son's hand, both of them grinning as Sterling's remaining lawyers hurriedly packed their briefcases. Sterling himself sat motionless, his empire crumbling around him. When federal agents approached to discuss the terms of his surrender for the criminal charges, he seemed almost relieved, as if a great weight had lifted. Outside the courthouse, the scene was jubilant. Preservation societies from across the state had gathered, holding signs celebrating the victory. News crews interviewed residents about the impact of the decision. Maya's professor announced plans for a national conference on community preservation rights. Diana gathered their core team in her office for a celebration. "This isn't just a legal victory," she said, raising a glass. "You've created a blueprint for other communities to fight back against corporate destruction of historic neighborhoods." Rachel, finally able to relax after months of tension, shared stories about the evidence she'd hidden away. "I never thought my obsession with documentation would help save entire communities," she laughed. Trevor Matthews reported that building inspectors across the state were already reviewing suspicious demolition orders. Sterling's tactics won't work anymore. People know what to look for now. Elizabeth Kane, no longer hiding behind her Victoria, Blackwood persona, provided a flash drive containing details of similar operations in other states. "My testimony here is just the beginning," she promised. "There are more developers using these tactics, and now we know how to stop them." Mrs. Liu's granddaughter's live stream of the verdict had gone viral, drawing international attention to the preservation movement. Preservation societies from other countries were reaching out, sharing similar stories and seeking advice. James Chen announced that several legitimate developers had already approached him about creating new guidelines for responsible development that respected historic properties. "Not everyone wants to destroy history," he noted. "Some want to help preserve it." Barbara Henderson shared news that residents who had been forced to modify their homes could now restore their original features. Her son's Heritage Watch platform was being expanded to help other communities document and protect their historic properties. But the most meaningful moment came when Ellie returned home. Her historic house, which had become a symbol of resistance, now represented something more, proof that communities could stand together and win against seemingly unstoppable forces. As she walked through her garden, where Sterling's bulldozers had once threatened to destroy everything, she found her neighbors gathering spontaneously. They brought food, drinks, and stories, turning her yard into an impromptu celebration of community triumph. Maya called from university, excited about the implications. "Mom, this changes everything. Professor Williams says the ruling will be studied in preservation law classes for years. You didn't just save your house. You helped create new protections for historic communities everywhere." Diana arrived with more news. The Attorney General's office was creating a special task force to investigate similar cases across the state, and they wanted her to consult. The judge's recommendation for a historic preservation oversight committee was already gaining support in the legislature. As evening fell, Ellie sat on her porch, surrounded by friends and supporters who had become family through their shared struggle. The lights of her historic home glowed warmly behind her, each weathered brick and aged shingle telling a story of perseverance and victory. Her phone buzzed with messages from other homeowners fighting similar battles, seeking guidance and hope. The movement they'd started was growing, spreading to other communities facing their own preservation battles. Sterling's empire had fallen, but something far more valuable had risen in its place. A network of communities united in protecting their heritage, armed with the knowledge and legal precedent to fight back against corporate greed. Looking at her home, still standing proud despite everything Sterling had thrown at it, Ellie realized they'd achieved something even more important than a legal victory. They'd proven that when communities stand together, even the most powerful developers couldn't erase their history. The impact of Judge Martinez's ruling rippled through communities nationwide. Within weeks, the state legislature passed the historic Preservation Protection Act, incorporating all of the judge's recommended reforms and adding stronger penalties for developers who targeted historic properties. The new Historic Preservation Oversight Committee took shape with an unexpected chairperson, Mrs. Liu. Her decades of documenting community displacement made her the perfect choice to lead the organization. The committee's first action was creating a rapid response system for threatened historic properties, inspired by Barbara's son's Heritage Watch platform. Diana found herself traveling between states, helping other communities implement similar protections. Sterling's tactics weren't unique, she explained during a conference call with preservation groups, but now we have a legal framework to stop them before they start. Maya's preservation class had turned their research into a comprehensive guidebook, Protecting Community Heritage, a practical guide to fighting predatory development. The book became required reading in urban planning programs nationwide. Trevor Matthews led a complete overhaul of the building inspection system. "No more Friday afternoon emergency demolitions," he announced, implementing new procedures requiring Preservation Office review for any historic property citations. The Restoration Fund, created from Sterling's seized assets, began its work. Barbara Henderson's Victorian home was among the first to be restored to its original condition. The before and after photos became powerful symbols of resurrection, rather than destruction. Rachel's meticulous documentation methods became the standard for preservation societies. She developed a training program teaching communities how to protect themselves through proper record keeping. "Information is power," she reminded her students. "Document everything." Elizabeth Kane traveled the country, testifying about similar schemes and helping authorities identify other developers using Sterling's tactics. Her evidence led to investigations in 12 states, with more developers facing charges each week. James Chen returned to city planning, but now headed a new division focused on harmonizing development with preservation. "We don't have to choose between progress and heritage," he insisted, working with architects to create guidelines for sensitive urban renewal. The Oakridge Gardens HOA transformed under Judge Washington's leadership. The new bylaws, written with community input, focused on preservation and support rather than control and conformity. Other neighborhoods began adopting their model. Mrs. Liu's granddaughter's social media campaign evolved into a national movement. Would Save Our History became a rallying cry for communities facing similar threats. Her documentation of the case inspired a documentary series about grassroots preservation efforts. Alex Torres developed software to detect suspicious patterns in property transactions and building code violations. The program, freely shared with preservation groups, helped identify potential threats before they escalated, but the most significant changes were personal. Former Sterling properties were returned to their original owners or their heirs. Families who had been forced out years ago returned to restore their historic homes. Each restoration became a community event, with neighbors helping neighbors rebuild. Ellie's photography business boomed as she documented these transformations. Her images of restored homes and reunited communities appeared in national magazines, putting human faces on the preservation movement. The Heritage Watch platform expanded globally, connecting preservation groups across continents. Barbara's son worked with international developers to create guidelines for responsible development that respected local heritage. State Senator Catherine Martinez, inspired by the case, introduced legislation requiring community impact studies before any historic district modifications. "We're not just preserving buildings," she declared, "we're protecting the soul of our communities." As autumn returned to Oakridge Gardens, the neighborhood had transformed. Historic homes were being lovingly restored, their character celebrated rather than condemned. New construction continued, but now worked to complement rather than replace existing architecture. Maya called with news that preservation programs nationwide were seeing record enrollment. "People realize these old houses aren't just buildings," she told her mother. "They're our connection to the past and our bridge to the future." The victory over Sterling had created more than new laws and regulations. It had sparked a fundamental shift in how communities viewed their historic heritage. The movement they'd started had grown beyond anything they could have imagined, creating lasting change for generations to come. 1 year after Judge Martinez's historic ruling, Ellie hosted a special photography exhibition in her restored home. "Communities Worth Preserving" featured images of every house saved from Sterling's demolition plans, alongside portraits of the families who had fought to protect their heritage. The exhibition spaces flowed through her house, each room telling part of their community's story. In her studio, photographs documented the transformation of Barbara Henderson's Victorian home from its forced modernization back to its original splendor. The living room displayed Mrs. Liu's historical collections, now properly archived and preserved for future generations. Maya, fresh from completing her master's thesis on community preservation strategies, led tours explaining how each victory had contributed to stronger protection laws. Her research had helped shape preservation policies across the country, turning their local struggle into a national movement. Diana arrived with news that the last of Sterling's criminal cases had concluded. His empire was completely dismantled, its assets redistributed to community preservation funds. More importantly, the legal precedents established had already stopped similar schemes in 3 other states. Trevor Matthews announced that the reformed building inspection system had identified and prevented 15 attempted demolitions of historic properties in the past year alone. "The patterns are easier to spot now," he explained to visitors. "We know what to look for." Rachel's documentation methods had become standard practice for preservation societies nationwide. She now conducted workshops teaching communities how to protect themselves through careful record-keeping and early intervention. The Heritage Watch platform, expanded and refined by Barbara's son, had grown into an international network. Preservation. Groups from around the world shared strategies and supported each other's efforts to protect historic neighborhoods. As evening fell, neighbors gathered in Ellie's garden, the same space where Sterling's bulldozers had once threatened to destroy everything. Children played on the winding paths, while their parents shared stories of the community's transformation. Mrs. Liu's granddaughter live-streamed the event to her millions of followers, connecting their local celebration to a global movement. The #Sun Preservation Victory trended as similar communities shared their own success stories. Judge Washington, speaking to the gathered crowd, summed up their journey. "We didn't just save buildings, we proved that communities can stand together against corporate greed and win. Every historic home still standing is a monument to that victory." The reformed Oakridge Gardens, HOA, now focused on preservation and community support, had become a model for others. Their new bylaws emphasized protecting neighborhood character, while allowing thoughtful development that respected existing architecture. Looking around her beloved home, Ellie saw more than just preserved architecture. She saw the strength of a community that had refused to be erased, the power of people standing together to protect their heritage, and the promise of a future where progress didn't require destroying the past. Maya joined her mother on the porch, both of them watching the sunset paint the historic homes in warm light. "You know what's amazing?" Maya said. "Every one of these houses has a story now, not just about its past, but about how it was saved." Their victory had created something permanent, not just preserved buildings, but a blueprint for other communities to follow. They had shown that when people united to protect their heritage, no developer's bulldozer could stand against them. As night fell and lanterns lit up the garden, Ellie raised her camera one more time. The image she captured showed not just historic homes, but a living, breathing community that had fought for its soul and won. The legacy of their struggle wasn't just in laws or policies. It was in the countless communities now standing up to protect their own heritage, armed with the knowledge that they too could win. The story that had started with one woman's stand against demolition had become a movement, ensuring that future generations would have more than photographs to remember their history by. They had preserved more than houses. They had protected the very essence of community itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.